Welcome to Three, a part of the Tennis Channel podcast network. I'm Gill Gross with Joel Drucker and Amy Lundy. 2 days ago, Rafael Nadal took to social media to announce that he would retire after the Davis Cup finals in 2024. So we have an official endpoint for the absolutely stupendous, legendary, iconic career of Rafael Nadal. We actually did discuss a lot of the ins and outs of the possibility of when he might retire and would it be Davis Cup. We did that on our last show. A lot of the news of it all we've discussed. But I want to kind of start by taking some time to reflect on Rafa as a whole. And Joel, I'll start with you. There will be a lot of people poring over the numbers and everything he's accomplished numerically and statistically and the number of titles and all of that stuff. But we're always so interested, and I know you're interested in how he impacts the game moving forward and what we can kind of take from him and learn from him, and what the lasting legacy would be from Rafa. When I kind of set you up to discuss what comes to mind as far as that's concerned.
Well, first of all our conjecture added up, not ours, but Rafa added up nicely after
Yeah.
Davis Cup. He announces it, Davis Cup, pretty tidy, pretty tidy. Even if he doesn't play in the Davis Cup, he'll be with his teammates. Even if he doesn't feel healthy enough to play, which he'll play. We've got to think he's going to play. And the impact is tremendous. This unbelievable epic career that he's almost redefined, as all our three have, but he's redefined what it means to have an epic career. It's almost like a new era of like, no, a feature movie is not 2 hours. It's 6 hours on Netflix. It's a whole other length and span. And he's shown also becoming a great competitor. I think Nadal to me is probably one of about five players in tennis history you'd have play for your life, like Nadal, Novak, Jimmy Connors, Pete Sampras, Pancho Gonzalez. I mean, kind of titans of competitive excellence. And we can talk more about how that plays out and what that means. But I think the big impact is Nadal kind of redefining what epic is, reminding us most of all what it means to be a great competitor and have this respect for the opponents in the game, and just showing that in his manner.
Yeah, I think he's one of those sportsmen that embodied what the term gamer used to mean. Like gamer now means somebody who plays video games, but back in the day, it was that person who just lives to compete. Just recently, Pete Rose passed away, and certainly Rafa and Pete Rose are very different types of people, but the one thing they shared was just this incredible competitive fire. And, Muhammad Ali, Babe Ruth, like the people in sports, that secretariat, that you would just want in there if you really wanted to see somebody compete, like a gladiator in many ways. It's pretty special that he's going to go down as the best at something. If it wasn't the best at tennis, because he doesn't have all those records, although he has many, he's the best clay court player that has ever played. And he does have those records, at least for now. So he can look back on that and be really satisfied with that and treasure that. And, my other lasting impression that we're going to get into here shortly is just his style, his playing style, which was unique.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on a lot of it, and clay is almost the surface of competitiveness because it is physically the hardest. It takes the most out of you on a point by point basis, and that's the environment. Not just for that reason, not just the mental side, but it's one of the reasons Rafa thrived on the red clay by far more than anybody else ever. It's amazing that he was able when he was out there on the, playing matches, maintain like an 8 out of 10 energy level basically at all times, sometimes up to 10 out of 10, but it was basically always at least 8 out of 10. And you never got that negativity dump that sometimes you'll get from the most energetic players. Like you don't, there are players who wear their heart on their sleeve and they play with a lot of emotion, and you almost always get like the roller coaster effect that comes with it, where you have this energy dip, and or you don't have a lot of composure because you play with so much fire. And Rafa had all that fire, all that energy without any of the negative things that usually comes with that, because he was able to just keep it at 8 out of 10 and stay there. And it must have been so difficult on the other side of the net, and we know that it was because we've heard from players who have experienced it. The guy just wouldn't go away. He just kept coming at you mentally.
Well, what he showed, and we can weave this in through us about kind of even the lesson that anyone who picks up a racket at any level can learn. And winning is hard, but competing is easy. Competing is about effort and engagement and staying in it. And Nadal is the top of the list for that. And you're right. Always this positive, not discouraged, not watching him and not really being able to tell what the score is with that intensity. It's not like he was a poker face player with the energy. He was at this kind of high pitch of intensity while always being positive, as opposed to you. Oftentimes, some of the ones who play at that intensity, it's going to go like that a little. Not. It's funny. The ones who I consider among the great competitors, they don't. But I think again, competing is easy. That's about trying. The winning part, winning is not so easy. And Nadal did plenty of that too. But he had his losses, and that's all part of the journey as well.
Stylistically, what do you think, Amy, will be the first thing people think about with Rafa? Because it actually might be just the competitiveness. But beyond that, do you think it's the athleticism because he was such an imposing athlete, or do you think it's just the forehand, or is it
The
something else?
forehand.
The
The
forehand.
forehand. The buggy whip, lefty forehand that, I mean, Joel asked us to think about the first time we had seen Rafa play in person, and I saw him at the 2005 US Open. He played James Blake. He lost that match. 2005 was his big, breakout year. So he was just coming up. Um, and he was wearing the capri pants, and he had the headband, and he was like, he appeared to me to be this swashbuckler who hit the ball in a different way than I had seen. And my first thought was, this isn't going to work. Like it just didn't seem to my eye like it was something that was done. Of course, it did work, and it worked really well on clay, and that was because of his margin and his topspin. It was really incredible on that particular surface. But to his credit, he's one of the greats even outside of that surface. So he was incredibly adaptable.
Yeah, and you said the forehand and I think I just wrote this down so you can't RPM. I mean the top spin and we're talking about epic careers. There are only three men who've won majors in their teens, 20s, and 30s. And that's Ken Rosewall, Pete Sampras, and Nadal. And each of them took one of the game's strokes and took it to a whole other level of genius. Rosewall with the backhand, Sampras with the serve, Nadal with the forehand. And so that's part of the super genius package. Yeah, no question. I think that's the shot. That's the shot that we'll all remember. I like that you brought up the whole buggy whip and the top spin and the banana and the bending and the use of the contemporary technology, which is great, whether it's the Babolat and the strings, right?
I like that Amy said margin because
Hmm.
sometimes it's misunderstood. I think sometimes the effect of Nadal's topspin is partially misunderstood. Partially also because of the Federer rivalry and how everyone was very focused on how high the ball would jump up over Federer's shoulders on the one-handed backhand. There's so much more though to the level of RPM that he was able to produce, and it comes down to the fact that he could hit, say, an 80 miles per hour forehand, which is fast, and he could hit it with 4 feet of net clearance, and the ball could land well inside the baseline. And as we see, heavy topspin, I think more and more on the tour, we kind of take for granted that that's how it is. But I think what the topspin allowed him to do and probably completely changed the game forever as far as just reimagining what topspin can be. Obviously, topspin very much existed for a very long time, but just to kind of raise the ceiling on it, like Nadal did, it just made it so that he could sustain a level of aggression on his attacking forehand without missing. And it was relentless, and it was over and over and over again. And he could spread the court as well. And I think when players talk about how exhausting it was to play Rafa, I think so much of it is the fact that he was moving you around with that forehand from the middle of the court, and like you just would never get a break from running corner to corner off of it.
Not only was it consistent, it was troubling to your own contact points. I talked to a number of former pros, guys who played in different decades, and when they look at the big three, they can almost, even though they are aware of how much bigger all the balls, all those guys are, Novak and Roger and Rafa, they can sort of picture themselves, okay, Roger's got the one-hander, it's bigger than mine, but it's kind of ball, the bounce is kind of coming waist high, and the slice is nasty, but they faced slices before and this and that. And Novak, fairly flat. They talk about Rafa and they start to wonder how they're going to win points, not just on how they're going to even make contact effectively with the ball. Anyone, we've seen enough of Rafa versus one-handers. So there's entire generations of players who, if you took them from the decades, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, how am I going to even return this guy's ball? And then it gets to all the other things too, the top spin and the depth and the angles and the left-handedness. All of it was just like a whole, yeah, incredible.
I mean, we have to remember that tennis is a game of errors. That's how most points are won, when your opponent makes an error. And all that margin does really over the net, inside the baseline, on the sides, all that margin does is decrease the percentages that you're going to make an error. So in a way, the top spin that Rafa hit, and as you pointed out, being able to swing about as hard as he wanted to, and he's a strong guy, all it did was increase his percentages. It's kind of like the unseen way that he won. And he just didn't miss a lot.
And when you combine that with the fitness levels, which
Yeah.
I think you could argue also that that's another way that he kind of pushed everybody, because you'd call him, Joel, like you'd agree, right? He's probably the most, at least let's take a snapshot of 2010. There's no debate that he's the best raw athlete in tennis.
I'll take out the word athlete. I don't know what an athlete.
I guess what I'm saying when I say athlete, I'm not talking about hitting a ball. I'm just talking about how fast do you
Physical
run.
fitness.
Yeah, how fast do you run? How quick do your feet move? How long does it take for you to get tired? How strong are you? All that stuff.
Okay, so you added up those things that have nothing to do with hitting the ball. It says like raw, not raw, of certain kind of physical. I suppose so. But more importantly, his ability to physically impose himself on people was there. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is, the speed around the court, his ability to keep the ball in the court, and then he added so much more uh proactive kind of, he created this entire tool shed of attacking weapons that you could say was underrated, but I think everybody had kind of learned to respect. Okay, Nadal's got a great drop shot. Nadal has amazing volleys. The hands are amazing. But at the base of it all was the best fitness, a refusal to miss, and a crazy competitiveness. And I think that combination was like kind of the foundation of it all.
Agreed. One year in Australia, I think it might be the year you were there too, Amy, when we were there. And I watched on consecutive days, I watched the Federer match and I watched the Nadal match. And I think the Nadal match, I think played Schwartzman at the Australian Open one year. And the Federer match, I recall seeing, if you play Roger Federer, you've been dissected, you've been curated. You're not necessarily, and you come away feeling like you've been watching a tennis skills contest. When Nadal, you felt like you'd been like you knew you competed. And so I think to get to your assertion about 2010, I would say Nadal, the most physically imposing player, the one who, like Roger, you knew you're going to be, things were going to happen to you, and eventually you're going to be able to, wow, I'll get to tell my family I played, witnessed some genius here. Somebody did won some points, and you become sort of a witness in your own dissection. Um, Novak will discuss that. That's in Novak's somewhere in Novak's sort of clinical too, but he can kind of break down your legs and your game. Nadal was just a whole, all of it, mental, physical, right? Like, oh my God, this is not, like you said, he's not going away. How am I going to win points? What's happening here?
I mean, that was true of Nadal even at the very end when he was playing Bastad. Ask Cam Norrie, ask Navoni. Like these guys lost just a few months ago. Very intense physical matches to Nadal. And by the way, these are high quality players. And he got them by wearing them down in his same style that he always has.
First time I watched Nadal, I don't remember television. I'm not sure, but I know live. I know live US Open 2010. And I remember who it was against. It was against Basilashvili, the Russian player. I think what was striking about watching Rafa in person at Arthur Ashe Stadium was the force of it all and the violence of it all. It's almost like when you watch, you're watching in baseball, it's a home run. In basketball, it's a posterizing dunk. There's a level of power and force and intensity and electricity that Nadal was bringing in. Of course, he won the 2010 U.S. Open. That was the tournament that he was serving uh, very, very big. He was serving 130, and then I think it bothered his shoulder so much that ultimately he would never go back to even trying to serve like that. But that's my first memory of watching Nadal live, at least.
'03 US Open, Yunus El. So he's 17 and he loses 7-6, 6-3, 7-6. And I saw I think a journalist from Spain who'd known him, always someone from the country who'd known him from a little further back. And I said, wow, that's quite a forehand. Yeah, this is Nadal. And I always think it's interesting how you refer to someone by the last name, it's like it's iconic, right? The
Mhm.
last name or the first name, whether it's Cher or Nadal, it's just something kind of evocative. And then soon enough, a great Davis Cup effort in Spain versus the US in '04 really put him on the map. But my first time I remember seeing him in '03, and yeah, it was impressive. But again, my attitude is always with the teenager. Okay, let's see. I'm not an investor. I'm not a speculator, but soon enough, we all saw, and certainly by '05, I mean, boy, that '05 teenager, he wins, I forget if he won 11 tournaments that year, and including his first ever time at Roland Garros. Just incredible rival. I mean, this guy, soon enough, he wasn't a star, he was a supernova.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't take him very long to dominate clay in those mid 2000s, but he wasn't okay with just being clay guy. Like he immediately was like, I want to win Wimbledon, right? That became a goal for him. I think around like 2006. I know in 2007 he became very, very close. And then I know from his book, it's very well documented that he kind of was almost we think about Nadal, I guess, prioritizing Roland Garros and building his season around peaking for Paris. But at that time, he wanted to win Wimbledon so badly that was clearly the North Star of his motivation and what he wanted to do. And then he played that incredible final in '08 with Federer that he ended up getting through in 5 sets just before the sun went down and they weren't going to be able to see the ball anymore. By the way, I do remember that one. I imagine that's not the first time I watched him on TV, but I do remember watching that match.
He got to Wimbledon 5 straight times when he played it. I think what happened after he got to Wimbledon from the finals from '07 to '11, he missed one year in there, but he got to the finals those years. But then I think the narrative line around Nadal when he suffered several early losses around at Wimbledon shifted to, okay, yes, he's the clay guy, and Wimbledon will be what it will be. But there are 5 straight years there he's in the finals of Wimbledon, and he's doing pretty well, and he's winning on 2 occasions. He won them back to back. He won the French and Wimbledon back to back. So that was a pretty good campaigns from him, and how he dimensionalized his game. I mean, I think that's part of lesson two. I mean, I joke he had to embrace his inner John McEnroe to
Yeah.
become successful at Wimbledon. Slice backhand, some more volleys, little serve and volley, which just things that broadened his game. I'm kind of yeah, Wimbledon. He gets the finals in '06, '07.
Look, he played well at Wimbledon right up until a few years ago. This guy could improvise better than almost anybody ever. When all hell broke loose in the point, that's when I really gamble on Nadal. That's when I put the house on Nadal, pretty much no matter who he's playing, except for maybe Roger or Novak, and now Alcaraz. Alcaraz has a little bit of that same quality. Um, whether it's running down a lob or he's at the net or he has to flick something or my coach always says there's no such thing as a backhand overhead, and I always correct him and say Nadal can hit that shot. Um, just being able to think on his feet and really relishing it, like wanting to be in that situation or being okay with being in that situation is a big part of his greatness. And that is how he was able to translate to other surfaces. Grass, where even the buggy whip, he made it work, shortening up strokes or even on some of the faster surfaces like the hard court of the Australian Open, he was able to adapt his game and make it work. That I think is such a big part of his greatness, maybe even beyond the greatness on clay.
Yeah, I mean the hands were insane. And the skill building was clearly there. Carlos Moya came in, I believe around 2018, and it was a mindset shift that he was trying to hammer home into Rafa, particularly give yourself the green light if it's there early in the point. Serve +1. Because Nadal's mindset earlier on was, I'm not going for broke on the first ball. It's not in the DNA. It's not kind of what I do. I think Moya was tasked with an aging Nadal, and that was one of the first things that I think Carlos was focused on was, you have a great forehand weapon. Crush it right away if it's there. Don't wait. Like let's get this done with. And then the longevity factor, we can get into that because he proved everybody wrong, Amy. Like nobody gave him a chance to contend for slams at 34 years old when he was 24 years old. The narrative was that he'd never make it that far.
Well, he had of the big three, he had by far the most injuries and time was away. And so the more the thing was, wow, how long is it going to last? Look, as early as '05, when he was 19, had a foot issue that kept him from, that could have ended his career. So there's always this sense hanging over Nadal. And maybe that's also one of the reasons why he played, as Jimmy Connors said, why he played like he was broke. Because, this could be this, they say play it like it's your last match. Well, it could have been. He didn't have as much confidence in his ability to have longevity. His technique wasn't as efficient as Roger Novak. So there came more improvisation. There came more sort of the point, a different kind of rally. And then him being left-handed, the opponents are trying to question him in different ways. There was kind of an unpredictability to some of Nadal's points. Other times there was a predictability. He's hitting the forehand cross court. But other times the point would certainly erupt into this whole other. It started off one way, and next thing you know, whoa, what's happening here? And he's scrambling, and he's having a great passing shot, and all this stuff.
There was a lot of variety, though, especially
Yeah.
from the back of the court, especially on his backhand. It's one of the things I always like to focus on with Nadal, because, of course, most of the time when he was hitting his backhand, the goal was to generate a forehand that he can attack. But
Right.
he was so good at low slice, high loopy ball down the line to, get it up high on the righty backhand. That always set up his forehand. He was so good at like he was a real thinker in terms of I'm going to change the height, I'm going to change the spin, I'm going to add some width. Now I'm going to inject some pace. There was so much variety in the baseline rallies, and I think again it almost comes down to this overarching theme of whatever Rafa is most known for, or whatever, like all the things that came naturally to him, which is grinding and the forehand and the competitive nature. It almost makes it so that the other areas can be underlooked.
You're right, because it's so visceral and so captivating. The energy, the intensity. I like the study part. Like when you were talking about the tactics, it made me think, I wonder what the Rafa film study sessions were. And of course, it's hard to think, is Rafa sitting in a chair next to Moy or Uncle Tony, deliberately looking at things because he has so much energy, right? So much energy. See, I can see Roger doing that. I can see Roger sitting down and say, oh, I see. But there's something about the energy of Nadal that makes it, but I'm sure he did. And I would love if I had a fellowship to take a great player and look at every 3 year periods of their career and take like 3 or 4 matches from each of them and see what's going on technically and tactically. Like, okay, the '05 Rafa, the '08 Rafa, the 2012 Rafa, and see and you see things because I mean I look at some things change with the backhand. Like the backhand initially was a little more the weaker side. It's always was the weaker side, but it got even more times he flattened it out, and it's his own other shot. It's a special shot, and see how he altered it. And then many things with the serve. Remember in 2010, he was serving north of like 120, 125 for a while when he won the U.S.
Yep.
Open. And
Mhm.
and then of course part of the stuff with the serve is also because he's a righty who learned to serve lefty. So there's something non-natural about that.
I mean, one thing that I know became central for him, and this might have been early in his career, I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and check, but I know that I was charting some of his matches, circa 2017, 2018, 2019, and he was very proficient at running around to hit forehand in places that nobody else would ever dream of doing that. So, in other words, if you divide the court up into zones and his forehand is hit in the outermost zone, which would be zone D, um, he could run around all the way on the opposite zone to hit a forehand if the speed of the ball was such that he had time to do that. And in the latter stages of his career, for sure, he really started to do that more and more and look for that forehand in all parts of the court. His footwork was so impeccable, which is ironic because this is a guy who had a congenital foot problem. So the I'm sure he used data and I'm sure he looked at film. Well, I know he used data. Um, but the way that he managed all that and that particular tactic to run around and hit forehand was something that became a major weapon for him.
It's a Tony thing also. Like it's a philosophy, and I think Spanish coaches largely emphasized that and they call it the invertido. And Rafa, you know, I always observed that the bigger the point, the more effort Nadal was going to exert to try to run around. Because it is more tiring. Anyone who's ever played knows it's way easier to stand in the middle and hit a backhand. It takes more footwork and then more energy to recover. It's just a more exhausting thing to do to run around the forehand. Nadal wasn't much of an energy saver, so he did it all the time. But I remember, always noticing that on a break point, whether for or against, it would just get up, it would go to another level where he'd be that much quicker shuffling to his right to make forehands.
Right. Well, yeah, it's like a classic tennis thing. I will bring my strength to bear here somehow.
Yeah.
It's like it's like a Stefan Edberg or Patrick. I'm gonna get to net. And then
Right.
Rafa's case, this point's gonna win or lose. I'm gonna hit a forehand. You're gonna have to beat me, buddy, while I'm trying to hit forehands. And it was incredible how he would move all the way to his rights. I think I want to talk a little about Uncle Tony. I think Uncle Tony is obviously uh and I think I want to start with him and his sense of values. I mean, the ways he from a very young age let Rafa know, yeah, good. You're good at like the great story I love is there's a 12s tournament and Uncle Tony shows Rafa the list of all the people, and Rafa, I haven't heard of any of these guys. He's, yeah, there you go. That's how important this is. In other words, just a constant. It's not just perspective. It's about values, and you're not
So
more
so
important.
Rafa won the tournament, right?
I think he won the tournament. Yes.
And then Uncle Tony showed him the list of players who have won the tournament, and he said, maybe don't celebrate so hard, kid, because you've never heard of any of these guys.
Well, that's right. And I think so many things. Now, part of the Uncle Tony seems a little like a constant kind of humbling, but also a constant kind of like seeing what it all is, having the respect for the opponents, having the respect for the racket. Rafa never broke a racket. Having this respect for the game and the opponent and how you treat people. That's why at a time, I think Nadal had a tough time playing people he didn't like because he wanted to have just fair competition among people who liked each other. It's a game. And then we'll shake hands. It's what the game should be. Let's obliterate each other and then shake hands, and the winner will buy dinner. And Uncle Tony, I think, is really responsible for Rafa. I mean, Rafa himself may have had some attitudes. It's hard to think of him as an unruly child.
Yeah, but it seems like Tony was an enforcer in that
Yes.
respect. I mean, it was so many parents are the opposite, right? I was actually talking about this with someone recently. I won't get into the details of the story, but there are so many delusional parents out there as far as athletics, and I know it goes beyond athletics. There are a lot of parents who think their kids are actually maybe better than they really are, and that's the message they're delivering. And look, it's obviously this is now a discussion about the psychology of a kid and parenting, but uh that it can be maybe it can be just as damaging to a young athlete to say you're great, you're awesome, you're the best. Maybe that can be, that can have some real downsides, and certainly Uncle Tony wasn't doing any of that.
I'll tell you a thing that makes me think of Uncle Tony recently. I was talking to a parent, and the parent loved Nadal, and the kid loved Nadal, and Nadal was their player. And the parent was saying how, yeah, my kid came across this pusher in a tournament and lost. You know how those pushers are. I said, wait, the person who got the ball in the court more than you? And they said, well, I guess whatever. I said, what do you think Uncle Tony would have said to Rafa if Rafa came home having lost to Steven, the so-called pusher? And the parent, I don't know. I said, Uncle Tony would have said, meet your new best friend. You're gonna play Steven every day for the next 14 days. That's your guy. And it's kind of this blind spot. There's no question. So I think the developmental lessons from Rafa and Tony are tremendous about the respect for people. You think, yeah, Tony would never have let Rafa get away with talking like that. So it's definitely toxic to tell your kid he's terrible. It's toxic to tell him he's great. How about just tell him he's your kid and we're going to do some work again and again and again. That's what it is. And that's what you saw. That's the Nadal lesson.
What I find kind of neat is that Rafa's parents turned him over to Uncle Tony. Like I just think like, so my son plays football, and he plays like a specialty position. What if I just turned him over to my brother? Like that would drive me crazy. I'd be like, I mean, I love my brother, but I would just, I would well, I would either meddle or I would want nothing to do with it, one or the other. But it's interesting to me the family dynamics there and how it really worked. I mean, Rafa must have come from a wonderful, supporting, loving home. But Uncle Tony definitely was the one who was tasked with teaching him this sport and instilling some of the sporting values.
And
And
the
it
other,
really
well, the
worked.
uncle, and the uncle who was the great soccer player,
Yes.
Miguel,
Yes.
right? That's right. And
Miguel, yeah.
Yeah. But Amy, first, doesn't your brother live about 2,000 miles from you?
Yeah, but if he didn't,
But see, think of Nadal, I think of them as it's the extended family. I mean, it says a lot about how families, a
hmm
certain family that was kind of around each other frequently, maybe always. So it was a different thing. I mean, it's like people know whose cousins are more like siblings, as opposed to other people whose siblings are
hmm
more like cousins. You know,
hmm
It seems again, it's been Rafa wrote, Joel, you have Rafa's book, right? When did this come out, this book?
this book came out in 2011.
I mean, that's a little bizarre, right? I mean, we were kind of talking about it off air. It's like, shouldn't you have maybe waited a sec? But I remember reading that, and it gets into the childhood, and I'd love a refresher on some of that. But my recollection is it was very familial. I mean, it was
hmm
Mallorca island, and everyone was kind of around each other. Really, really big family. But I think you had Tony, who could be the disciplinarian because you knew that there was enough maybe love and nurturing and kind of softiness elsewhere, right? And I guess that makes sense. And we've seen that it can get complicated when it's parent coach that has so many challenges in its own right. So at least it could be uncle
Uncle,
coach. Well, I'm
Uncle
saying at least
Coach.
it could be uncle coach and parent.
hmm
That's right. I remember
That's
seeing.
what I find interesting. Like, did did Rafa's dad ever have like tense moments with Uncle Tony over Rafa's training? Probably. It would be bizarre if they didn't.
Yeah.
But they made it work to great effect. And that's what I find. Somebody should write a book just on that.
Also, the thing with this is the other thing though that gets at aspects of the game. It appeared that I'm sure the results were working. So even though he hadn't heard of those other people who'd won the 12s tournament, he'd won the 12s tournament. So no, this is like I said to a coach once. They said, "Yeah, you talk about the process, but nothing validates a process better than a good outcome." So
Yes.
I bet Rafa, we know enough about Rafa to know that Rafa was attaining high quality outcomes from a very young age.
Yeah.
So there's quite the dilemma. But yeah, it's and Tony had played tennis. Rafa's father had not. So the whole deal, and Tony was kind of the philosopher of the family. That comes across very clear in the book about Tony with his ideas, Tony with his thinking, Tony with his reading, Tony with his tennis. And it's kind of yeah, it would be an interesting story. That's why I can't wait to read Chris Clary's book about Nadal, about what occurred in those developmental things, because it'll be different from a third person view from a writer like Chris, who will have done research and talked to other people. And were there other instructors or coaches in Mallorca who were vying to work with Rafa? Did Tony gain expertise from them? How did it work? All these different stories about that.
We talk about Novak and Jannik Sinner skiing. Rafa was also an impeccable soccer player. Now, I don't think he was like Jannik, who was maybe not like fully focused on tennis until 14 years old. It wasn't like that, but I think the soccer was at a very high level for Rafa. And I think that's another part that I think is interesting when you look at what kind of player he ended up being. I mean, the footwork, it's a lower body sport. You'll hear a lot of people say that. I think it's so true. And Nadal's lower body was just always in so many ways the ideal of movement on a court. Um, and then the other thing I think that, because Tony was so focused on keeping Rafa humble, we even saw when Nadal was, 30 years old and in the teens in terms of how many majors he'd won playing the first round against the world number 130, I think he genuinely felt like, "Oh, this guy's good. I might lose." And his mentality never came from confidence, it came from insecurity. And then the insecurity was the driver of, I better focus. I better be on it because if I'm not, I might lose. So I find it fascinating. I think that Rafa and Novak and Roger, I think it's a completely different mentality when they walk onto the court. And obviously there's no better, there's no worse. It's just different. But I think Nadal was driven by the insecurity of, I have to train so hard. I have to be on it, or I will lose because my talent will not get me there. Even though a lot of that was, maybe Tony almost lying to Rafa and Rafa lying to himself because he was that talented, where he probably didn't need to go 110% all the time and he would have been just fine. But the fact that he felt he needed to, I found that was fascinating also to read in the book, where Nadal got into kind of his mentality going into matches.
Well, it's stated insecurity. I mean, I think he had
You
plenty
don't
of.
think it's real?
I don't know what insecurity is. It's an insecure person myself.
But
I just think it's stated. I think that was his. I think these athletes, and I'll just say the sport I know most, which is tennis. I think they
mhm.
construct a verbal set of series of messages. And Nadal was always doing that bar thing. That was Nadal's thing about I don't know and I'll see and I'm not sure. And that was his way of whether it's managing the pressure or creating the thing. I don't know, it's insecure or not secure. I think it was kind of Nadal's way of being kind of his way of being kind of real. You said Gill, the other two were they were different. What do you think their deal was?
I'm the best. I'm winning. I'm
Ah,
I'm I'm the greatest. I don't think Rafa thinks like that.
you think Roger and Novak both had that? Do you think that was their deal? Where did that come from?
I think some athletes visualize success and they close their eyes and they see success and then they try to emulate it. And that's an approach. I almost think Rafa saw failure and then fought really, really hard to avoid it. And I believe Nadal when he discusses his almost like when he sounds unconfident, when he speaks that way, I kind of believe him because sometimes I see on the court, like I think his confidence on the court was the most fickle of the three. And you could very much see when he had it and when he didn't. And normally he had it, don't get me wrong, because confidence is important as a player, and he would not have been able to accomplish what he accomplished without some level of confidence. But I don't think that came as easily to him as Federer or Djokovic.
It's an
What
interesting question. Michael Jordan verbalized that fear of failure or fear of losing really drove him. So that's why we know that he was that type of person. Nadal, I feel like, unlike Djokovic, I feel like he's never really let the public in. So we don't know. Like I'm trying to sit here and think, do I agree with what Gill is saying? And I just don't know because I don't feel like I know him well enough or what's going on inside his head. Whereas Novak tells you a little bit more, you know?
Yeah, no,
So
I
it's
totally agree.
really interesting to contemplate.
I think it's fun. It is interesting in interesting ways of all these coping mechanisms. And in that sense, Novak is a little bit more, let's say, like Agassi, like this is what's going on with me, and
Hmm.
and that's one way. And Novak, not Novak, Rafa is a little more like Sampras, like, and see me, I just drew, and I'll just say this since not everyone can see this. I have this note card on the left. I have this thing of this performance, and this is really the world they occupy. That's why I so like writing about a sport because it's actually, there's no question what's actually occurring. And then I find with a guy like all of these guys, particularly as their careers, kind of what do we call it? A cascade of messages that becomes the way the mutually agreed upon evolved way how we talk to Roger about Roger, how we talk to Andre, that becomes kind of the dynamic between us and those
Yeah.
people. And so it's the Roger one was often, it's been said that I'm the GOAT and aren't I the incredible and the apogee, you know, all the great players in the past come to love Roger. It's not surprising that these guys, and then for different reasons. So Rafa's got his thing going, which is born of actually also occurrences. Again, his career almost ended when he was 19, so it creates the narrative of dialogue. But to me, that's why I so like writing about sports is what they say is never more than 49% of what matters to how I think about it. 49% at the
Absolutely.
most. So it's kind of like whatever, because he sure ain't speaking insecurely with that forehand. When you can run around your backhand that much from that far, there's no insecurity. You are engaged, man. You were in belief mode. I am here to win this point. I'm not, you don't do that well, particularly given the physical, emotional, and even existential demands of clay. And just, yeah, I can't lose. I gotta run around my backhand.
Yeah, but the forehand to me was always a barometer where I could see how he was feeling based on how he hit the forehand. And if there was a little more depth and more speed, that was one thing. If there was not a lot of speed, not a lot of depth, there was always a lot of spin. Then you could see that, okay, there's some insecurity in that swing, that there was some, lack of conviction there. And I don't think you can tell on Federer or Djokovic's forehand usually how they're feeling. Rafa, you could look at the forehand, you know exactly how he's feeling.
Maybe they
I
had
mean,
other
there's
shots. Maybe they had other shots that so revealed. You know what I mean? Which was the revealer shot? Was it Federer's backhand? Was it his shortness of his point? It's like was Roger's thing, oh, he's trying to end the point too soon.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
they
think
were.
there's different levels to it. Like perhaps Nadal would feel insecurity at times and therefore need to step up his energy or whatever. But like I've played a couple of people where their physical fitness and their effort level, their marathoners, is so high that they, even if things are not going well for them or they're not having their best day, they think to themselves, okay, you may be firing your forehand today, your serve may be good, but I'll tell you one thing, you're not going to out effort me and you're not going to out discipline me. Those were the things that he always had in his bag. Where, even if all hell's breaking loose and everything else is going wrong, I will fight and I will effort and I will focus. And there's a couple quotes from that book. I read that book several years ago too, and a lot of it has left me, so I need to go back. But there's a couple things that I'll always remember. One is the discipline of always going to Roger's backhand, to the backhand, to the backhand, to the backhand, always to the backhand. And then the other thing was, I might be paraphrasing here, but it was basically every point is a fight for focus. So the point's about to begin, and maybe a thought creeps into your head or something, and you have to fight to get yourself back into where you're supposed to be. And that was something that even if he was not feeling confident, he could always feel confident in that.
And that was his thing. That triggered off my thought of the suffering thing. And we've talked about that because Nadal talked about that. And this gets to Gill. You had the most Spanish training. You worked with the great Chris Lewitt and understood the dynamics of that and kind of almost the self-selecting way that some of the Spanish system finds the ones willing to hit, you're willing to do the 50 ball drill. I mean, and
Mhm.
we've seen this with all the other Spanish players. I mean, Nadal is the super genius who expanded his game, but you look at the legacy of these players post from Sergio Ruggiero onto other ones, the Costas, the Ferreros, the Carreno Bustas, the Batista Aguas. I mean, these guys, you're in for it. I mean, that's why it'd be interesting to talk to all the players, let's say like Schwartzman or team, and say what did it feel like to beat Novak compared to beating Roger compared to beating Rafa, and what you knew you had to do to attain that. And you're right, and the whole Rafa, I've competed, and wow, and no wonder I lost in the next round. Because I just yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even on Rafa's worst day, I think errors were still unacceptable. So I'm never going to give it to you. Even on my worst day, my ball might land short, but I'm not going to miss. You're going to need to beat me. You're going to need to come up with something. And the last line of defense is the focus and the fitness and the legs and making balls in the court and running balls down, and especially when when he was in his athletic prime, which was, most of his career. If you look at, I don't know, 2000 and 2005 to, 2018, he could play this way largely, where the fallback was I'm making balls and I'm going to run balls down, even if I'm having my worst day.
He won in 2019. He won the French the US Open.
I know, but was that athletic prime? Like, again, he adapted his game. We've talked about how he kind of became a little bit more, by necessity, he became a little bit more offensive.
Well, whatever it was, he won the French the US Open in 2019. He won the Australian and the French in the Roland Garros in 22. I know what you mean. He became a lot more.
Physical prime, though. It
Yeah.
wasn't, I think Djokovic and
Yeah.
Nadal and Federer have won majors outside of their physical primes.
Well, that speaks to skill and all the other things you're right that make tennis incredible. I don't know, one thing I'm curious, what are some of your guys' favorite Rafa moments, matches that you watched?
When he won the Australian Open, beat Medvedev, totally unexpected, 2022, five-set match, dead to rights so many times. I had the match on in my kitchen and I was just pacing the floor up and down. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, there were so many great moments over the course of his career. Books have been written on Strokes of Genius was written on 2008 Wimbledon. But when I reach back into my own personal archive, that win in the Australian Open was simply incredible just because it was so unexpected at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that run had a lot of Federer 2017 in it, because the expectations were low at the start of the year because of injury stuff, and then bang, and the way he won it was incredible. There's not an obvious one for me. If you're saying like favorite Rafa match or favorite Rafa win, uh, I you know I there's a deep cut for me in there. There are a couple of deep cuts in there where I felt the quality was incredible. Like as far as watching highlight videos go, I'll say if you're not going to watch the full match, you're just going to watch highlights and you want to be entertained. The Nadal Verdasco Australian Open semifinal in 2009, I want to say.
Yes.
it,
Yes.
it's just two guys who just got so dialed in on their forehand and then just went like strength to strength and were just knocking the fuzz out of the ball like I've never seen. That's one. And then I remember, I think Del Potro quarterfinal in 2018, where I realized, I guess on a new level, like the genius that Rafa had achieved, where he was clearly losing from the back of the court, and Del Potro was playing great, and the forehand was just pretty overwhelming. And Nadal went into can you pass me with your backhand mode. And he got to the net like 50, 60 times in the last like three or so sets. It was just a total adjustment. Like, yep, I'm not the better player from the baseline, but you can't pass me with your backhand. Nadal just went full net rusher against Del Potro at Wimbledon, won a great five setter. So those are two that like have kind of a special meaning to me because of how the tennis was. A lot of the matches that I think are most famous, he lost. 2012 Australian Open. He won the 2008 Wimbledon final, so that's an exception. The 2018 Wimbledon semifinal is probably the best Djokovic Nadal match in the recent era. That was an incredible match. Joel, I'm going to pass the baton to you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was at a lot of those, and we'll go back to the '09 Australian Open. I was in the Tennis Channel booth working for the '09 Australian Open with Verdasco and the final versus Roger. You got it just right, Gill. I mean, the Verdasco match was just tremendous tennis, and Verdasco, that was his contender period. That starts on a Friday night. It ends past midnight. Then Sunday, he plays Roger. That's also five sets, and that goes past midnight. So you realize even though there are only a few minutes each, Rafa was on the court 4 straight days. Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday night, Monday morning. And that was incredible. Two five setters. So that's great. And the single match I liked most that I was at was the 2013 Roland Garros semi versus Novak. The 9-7 in the fifth. Novak serving at 4-3 in the fifth, again on clay. So Novak tasked with he'd yet to beat Rafa at Roland Garros at that stage, and he came painfully close, and it was just great tennis and just incredible atmosphere, seeing the King of Clay potentially dethroned. I think if I had to take one single match, I would take that one. I would take the 2013 Roland Garros semi. If I had one Rafa one for the ages.
Yeah, that was a really, really great one. I rewatched that match in full during the pandemic, actually. And it was also just a classic Nadal forehand takeover. He just had the biggest weapon on the court, as was so often the case on clay. And then there was also, wasn't there, that was the net call, right? Djokovic on top
Yes,
of the net.
yes, Novak touches the net at a critical stage late in the match, and just the quality of the tennis. And each of these venues, when they get into that stage of a late fourth set and then on to the fifth, to be there, that's where that's where it takes tennis into this whole other level of brilliance, which is really the most captivating part of this. It doesn't happen often. Maybe that's what makes it great, like the Wimbledon 18 semi. That was tremendous. That was strange. That was over 2 days because it had been preceded by the Anderson Isner 26-24 epic. So it started late and starts on the roof. Great tennis, great quality tennis, and one of Novak's better efforts.
All right, we have covered a lot here, and I know we haven't covered many of the specifics of the retirement video and the Davis Cup finals and what that's going to be like. The Six Kings Slams exhibition, I believe we'll see him in this weekend. So that's coming up next. But, we wanted to kind of have this larger discussion. There's going to be plenty of time in the future to go over the ins and outs of Rafa's retirement and what that's going to look like. And hopefully it's as great a send-off as Roger had at the Laver Cup. I think it's shaping up to potentially be that. Fingers crossed. And that'll do it for this episode of 3. Remember, we're available on all podcast platforms. We appreciate it if you leave a rating and a review on Apple and Spotify. And if you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. We will see you next time on the next episode of 3.